want to do three things. As I said, Shrimi said, I said, I'll do a workshop on citation and plagiarism. She said, no, you will do a workshop on coherence. So I said, okay, we will do a workshop on coherence. So I thought through what coherence is. And while I realize there's a lot to be said and done about it, I'm going to do it in three parts today. The first part will answer the question, what is coherence? The second part will be about a writing strategy, about how we can write coherent sentences from the sentences we write. And we'll practice that. I'll spend quite a bit of time on that. That's an actual writing strategy that I hope you all will be able to use after the workshop. And then I also want to spend a little time thinking about the danger of hasty coherence. So while coherence is wonderful, and we'll try and figure what that is, I think it's also important to be aware of where it might become a problem or what kind of coherence might become a problem. So we'll think about these three things in the next several minutes, hour and a half that I have planned to do this for, and then we will have a discussion on it. So let's begin with a writing exercise, as I promised we will do. So a simple one. Here's an image on the side of the slide. May I request you to write one sentence to describe this image, and may I request you to give it a title. Now you just write this on your own. And as you have done it, just keep it, just write it. Don't put it in the chat box yet. I'll tell you when to do that. So one sentence that describes this image, which is on the left side of the screen. Having written the sentence to describe, and don't think too much about it, just write what comes to your mind. Once you've written the sentence, give this image a title. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next exercise. Now I request you to write one sentence to describe this image and give this image a title. Moshumi Guha, I think you have I think there's some scratches coming on the screen. I think you need to not use the whiteboard or something. Pritha, can you look into this? Pritha, can you disable annotations for the participants?
Yes, I'm checking that.
Yeah, thanks. So once you've described this image, please give this image a title. Once you finish doing this, at this point, if you like, you can actually now go back to your chat box and post the two sentences and the two titles together. So what you wrote for image 1 and what you wrote for image 2, what sentence and what title. You can now put this on the chat box. And as your responses start coming in, Preetha will read them out for me. In the meanwhile, I'll stop sharing and resharing my screen just to make sure that the disturbance that was happening can be.
Yeah, so for the first image, we have broken ties.
Broken, sorry, broken what?
Broken ties.
Broken ties. Nice title. Okay.
An abstract image which looks fit for a tiling design.
Oh, abstract image, tiling design. Nice. What else?
The second image is feathering, a parrot's feather on a sandy ground.
Feathering.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. A parrot's feather on a sandy ground. I think that's quite good.
Okay. Mohini says, first image is abstruse. The shapes within us that are absent makes us who we are, perfectly beautiful.
Okay, shapes that are absent in this.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the second
paying
one,
attention to the white spaces, paying attention to what's left white. Very nice. Right. Yeah.
And the second one is explode. The description is from monotony, the colors burst forth, painting the vibrancy of us and all.
Does anybody have a more descriptive image of what this is?
Yeah, so Shiny says soft shades for the second one. That is a smooth feather on a rough surface.
That's nice. Smooth feather on a rough surface. And what did Shiny have for the first one?
Definite chaos. That is a random pattern of geometrical shapes.
Random pattern, geometrical shapes. Excellent, right? Chaos, abstruse, abstract, right? That's what we are getting for this. And here we are getting, okay, it's feather on a rough surface. What else? What else? How else? What else do we have that describes this for what it is?
Kanishka says, first is abstract, which is cutouts of paper and shapes randomly spread on a sheet. And the second one is contrast, a feather placed over sand.
Very good. So give me a moment here. The second one is a contrast, feather
placed over sand.
Placed over sand. Excellent. So what are we saying? That for the first image, most people are coming up with words like random, abstract, and yet within that randomness, people are noticing some kind of shape, tiling, design, geometrical shapes. I love this idea of the definite chaos. The idea that this is chaotic, but even in the chaos, people are finding some random pattern. So there's a pattern, though it's random. It's chaotic, but there's a definiteness to that as well. So that's very, very interesting. And by the time we come to this, we are getting feather on a rough surface, contrast. We are getting the idea of a contrast, feather placed over sand. So that's very, very interesting. And now may I request you to do this? Now, having done the first two exercises, just take a minute or so to think about this. Write 2 sentences that describe your experience of feeling while writing about each image. 2 sentences that describes your experience or feeling while writing about each image. You can think about which one was easier, which one was harder, why was it so, or any other insight that you might have had describing the 2 images that you did just a little while ago. So once you're done doing that, do post it in the chat box so Preetha can read it out to me. Preetha, my screen is visible, right?
No, not yet.
Ananya, not yet.
It's not?
No.
Oh, that's strange.
You stopped sharing in between.
Why is my screen not visible? Okay, hold on just a second.
Yeah.
Good, okay, sorry. I was going on the assumption that my screen is visible. Now is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So I basically put down some of the responses I got, and now we are here. Write 2 sentences that describe your experience.
Upasana says, the first one confused me a lot. I couldn't think of something immediately, and there was chaos in my mind.
Very good. First image, confusing.
Yeah.
Right? And didn't know what to say.
Yes. Siddhi says, the possibility of multiple interpretations for the first image, whereas the second image was a clear, straightforward picture.
Very good. Hold on to that thought 1 second, Preeta.
Yes.
Possibility of multiple interpretations.
Yes. For the first image, the second one had a clear, straightforward picture.
Correct. So possibility of multiple interpretations, first image, and the second?
Clear, straightforward picture.
Right. So parrot's feather on a rough surface could be sand, could be sandstone actually. So there's not that much room. There's not that much room to interpret.
Right. Amurtha says, it was hard for me to describe the first image because I didn't know what I was looking at. I had to find some sort of explanation, a rationalization, I suppose, to write a sentence on it.
I love the word that had to figure / rationalize.
Right.
What to write. Very good. We will be coming to these points later on. Excellent. So what are we getting now? What we are getting is that the difference between, so what is the difference between the first and the second image is that the first image, we look at it, we don't know what the hell it is, right? And we come up with words that tell me, you came up with words that tell me that you don't know what this is. And what were those words? Abstract, chaos, abstruse. And within that, what Amartya said later was very, very interesting, that when we are faced with chaos, what do? So we may express and say that this is chaotic, but we don't stop there. We try and see some pattern, try and make some sense of it. And people made sense of it by saying, oh, there are geometrical shapes, it could be tiling design. It's random, but there is a pattern in it. Geometrical shapes, again, give you a sense of something that there is. Someone talked about, the absences in the images. So we tried to make sense of it. We tried to rationalize our narratives around making sense of it. So that's what we did with this image. And this one is kind of there. Right? It's kind of, we know what it is. It's a feather. And we said as much, and someone very helpfully pointed out that once we know that there's not that much more to say, there's not that much more room for interpretation, because it's kind of tells us already what there is, right? And most people will agree that it's a bird feather. Some may know it's a parakeet, others may not know it's a parakeet. Some may think it's sand, some may think it's sandstone. But once those details are given, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of argument about whether it is that or not, right? So it's a very, very, so we have these 2 images, and it turns out that working with the first one was much harder. And your insight is that while it was harder to work with the first one also came with a whole lot of possibilities. There was room for to say a lot many more things. In itself, the first image is not coherent, and different people saw different things in it. In itself, the second image is more coherent. And once people identify what that is, there is not that much more to say about it. Seems to be what I'm getting from the audience. So now, based on this, if I asked you this question, what do you think coherence is? And that is, after all, the topic of today's workshop. What would you say? How do we define coherence? What do you have to say about this? What is coherence? Just on the basis of what you all said so far, what is coherence?
Gopal says logical unification.
That's because you looked at something. But I will put it down. We will, in fact, know in a bit what you looked at because we will look at it together. What else? Just from doing the exercise, from your experience, and we will come back to this as well later on. From your own experience of doing this exercise, if you have to define what coherence is, what will you say? I'm not asking you to look up the meaning yet, but and I promise we will look at it together. But your experience.
S. Sinha says one that allows to make a definite meaning.
Okay, so coherence allows definite meaning.
Someone says a link.
A link.
Quite a few people said a link.
Wonderful. It's a link. It allows a link between what and what?
Between two things and
links, connection, right?
Yeah.
Linking, connecting. These are things that narrative. These are functions of narratives, right? And narratives help us make meaning, right? Express meaning, and that's what we got from the first one as well. And I'm not entirely sure that we always get definite meaning, but certainly one of the things that coherence does is it helps us express meaning. It may be definite at some points, it may not be so definite at others, and we want to think about that later. Anything else? Anything else?
Madhumita says a meaningful flow to the narrative that has no hiccups.
Okay, meaningful flow to the narrative. Lovely, right? And so if, for example, even with the very first image, if you started talking about that image in terms of absences and presences, presence of geometric designs, absence of, a specific identifiable shape, and you went on with it, that would actually be exactly how you describe it. It's a meaningful flow to the narrative. Wonderful. Anything else?
Beauty in patterns and orders, and ordered beauty.
Beautiful patterns and order, and it may or may not be beautiful.
Yeah.
But let's keep it there for the moment. But the idea of patterns and order, and our ability to see that, and narratives quite often are that. And what we just saw is that even in a situation where we are challenged with something where it's not evident right away, we find a pattern or find some kind of order and we narrate that, right? So these are excellent points, and I love the fact that several of you really took your experience and used that to define what coherence is at this stage. So that's wonderful, and we'll be able to come back to this also later on. So now what Gopal said, if we look at the definition of the word coherence, and I didn't go anywhere fancy, I just Googled it, and you have your Google snapshot right there. The dictionary defines coherence in this basic sort of way, that it's the quality of being logical and consistent, and it's also the quality of forming a unified whole. And I want us to pay attention to this. I will keep coming back to this. So coherence is being logical and consistent, and forming a unified whole in terms of whatever piece of work that we are doing, whether it's a piece of writing or a drawing or a law that we are shaping up or whatever else that we are doing, right? So we'll think about these two words. We will also keep in mind your own insight and experience as you did the very first exercise, and we'll see what happens with that. Now you see the very first text I had here is from Persepolis, one of the texts that you all shared with me as something that undergraduate students in DU are reading in the literature department. And what do we see here? Preetha, may I request you to read this panel out to me?
Sure. Something escaped me. Cadaver, cancer, death, murderer. Laughter? Ha ha, ha ha, ha ha. I realized then that I didn't understand anything. I read all the books I could. And the book, the name of the book is The Reasons for the Revolution.
Yes, thank you so much. So what are we seeing in this panel, right? So for those of you who've had a chance to read Persepolis, what this is in the context of. It's in the context of this author, Satrapi, who's trying to make sense of her life, of her world as she lives through a certain period in Iran, which sees a regime change from the Shahs to that of the Islamic Revolution. And she tries to make sense of that, right? And in this particular panel, what we see is basically her acknowledging a moment where she's like, I don't get it, right? So there are a bunch of things: cadaver, cancer, death, murderer, laughter, a list of things that don't make sense together, right? And she's like, I don't get it. And in the next frame, she's laughing and everybody's looking at her like she's just done something nonsensical. And she says, I realized then that I didn't understand anything. And I read all the books I could. I didn't understand what was going on in the society that I was living in, what my parents were saying, what all these different references were. And here you see her making an attempt to understand, and she's making an attempt to understand her life in relation to what's going on in her world by reading about it, right? So she immediately does what we all do as academics, right? So we don't understand something, we go read up on it. And she comes to it at a moment where she says, I don't understand what's going on, right? So it turns out that, that we love coherence. We love narratives that explain us and our lives and our worlds in a coherent way. But turns out our lives and realities are actually not coherent, right? Are they like, I mean, do we live, do we, is our own life, each of us, can we say that our lives are, have always been coherent, that it always makes sense? My sense is that the answer will be no, right? What about the world that we live in? Does everything in our world make sense? I think the answer to that will be an even more resounding no, right? Most things don't seem to be consistent and unified wholes. And we have to make an attempt to understand it as such, make an attempt to narrate it as such. So it seems as though this project of coherence is one which is actually a deeply philosophical one as well, one that makes our lives meaningful, because otherwise we are going to be, and that's always an option. And some people actually try to pay more attention to that than coherence, is a kind of nihilism, paying more attention to the chaos than the narratives that make that meaningful, right? But turns out that this is important precisely because of the absence of coherence, both in our lives and in the world and the realities that we see, right? So what are we noticing? We are noticing that that is what is actually really true, that we don't meet the world coherently. Though later on I will contradict myself also, that will come later. But right now, let's stay with this statement that, we live in an incoherent world. Our lives are incoherent. And yet we try, by reading, writing, understanding, creating habitats, making laws, policies, whatever else, to create narratives of consistent and unified lives and realities, right? So when we're studying literature, what are these authors doing? What is Satrapi doing? What are the others that we're going to look at doing? They are doing exactly that. They are trying to, create narratives that make sense of something that might not otherwise, right? So, so we looked at that, and here what I have is, I have excerpts from two of your other readings, one from Margaret Atwood's poem, This is a Photograph of Me, and one from the essay that you all are also reading, Comics as Literature by Hilary Shue. And so in these two excerpts, let's see what's going on. Shayantan, if you are there, may I request you to read this photograph. This is part two. So Margaret Atwood's poem, later on we'll look at all of it, but this is actually the second half of the poem. Shayantan, may I request you to read it?
Absolutely. The photograph was taken the day after I drowned. I'm in the lake, in the center of the picture, just under the surface. It is difficult to say where precisely, or to say how large or small I am. The effect of water on light is a distortion, but if you look long enough, eventually you will be able to see me.
Thank you so much, Shayantan. And I've highlighted one portion. I'll come back to that. In the meanwhile, Preetha, may I request you to read the excerpt from Hilary Shute?
Sure. Highly textured in its narrative scaffolding, comics doesn't blend the visual and the verbal, or use one simply to illustrate the other, but is rather prone to present the two non-synchronously. A reading of comics not only fills in the gaps between the panels, but also works with the often disjunctive back and forth of reading and looking for meaning. Comics as Literature, Shute 452.
Thank you so much, Preetha. So again, these are excerpts from your readings. Now, I've highlighted some portions, right? I've highlighted, if you look long enough, eventually you will be able to see me, right? And in Shute's extract, I have highlighted, a reader of comics not only fills in the gaps between the panels, but also works with often disjunctive back and forth of reading and looking for meaning, right? So we have these two excerpts in the side, and with the help of these excerpts, I want us to think about the question that I'm asking now. What is the relationship between incoherence and coherence, nonsense and sense, right? Margaret Atwood's poem is what? If you remember, if you read it, you will know. If you haven't read it, I'll just quickly sum it up for you. Margaret Atwood is pointing to, the poem is called This is a Photograph of Me, basically points to a photograph of, it's a blurry photograph of apparently an image where there is a house, a lake, and it's an image of the lake in which she drowned, right? The photograph was taken the day after I was drowned. And if you look long enough, eventually you will be able to see me. Now, are you able to, first of all, people who are drowned, are they able to come back and tell you that this is a photograph of me? So it's again a very incoherent, nonsensical situation. Right? That's not a possibility. Drowned people who are dead are not going to come and show you a photograph and say, look at that lake is actually a photograph of me. And if you look hard enough, you will be able to see me. So that's Atwood there. And Shute, talking about comics, it says, how do people read comics? They fill in gaps, and they also do a disjunctive back and forth, something that you all did when I gave you that very first image as well. You filled in the gaps. If you look long enough. By itself, what is presented may or may not be making full sense. So how will you answer the question? What is the relationship between coherence and incoherence, nonsense and sense? And it seems that these two things are not completely disconnected. So there is no nonsense without it being attached to some form of making sense. And there is no making sense unless that sense is made. So inherently, nothing seems to come with a kind of a sense. So for example, the feather and the sand, and we recognized a feather on a piece of sandstone. We recognized that and we said that it makes sense. But what kind of sense does that image make also? Like, I can ask you that. Well, yes, was it kept there by someone? Why is it photographed like this? Where is it? We actually don't know very much more about it than that. But in comparison to the first image, it seemed like it already made more sense than the first image did, right? But so I leave that question with you to think about what is the relationship, and the way in which we get Atwood's poem and Shute's text right here about how we read comics will give us some ways to think about that. So I leave that for the moment and ask you the next question. What then are writers of nonfiction, fiction, poetry, etc. doing? So as literature students, when we encounter literature, what exactly are our writers doing, people we are reading? And then as readers of all of that, all these different genres, and we've already encountered three, right? We've encountered a poem, we've encountered a graphic narrative or a graphic novel, and we've encountered a literary essay which is about studying graphic narrative. So 3 forms, and of course, we've also encountered images. So 4 forms we've already encountered. So as readers of these journals, what are we expected to do? And I think as the second year and third year students are, encountering their syllabus and they have to write papers and there are exams, the question often might be, in fact, I used to be asked this question all the time when I was an English honors student. So you read novels, then what? So you read a poem. After reading a poem, what do you do with it, right? I'm honest. I don't know if you all also get this question, but I used to get this question all the time. People would say, well, what do you do in English honors after reading all the poems and everything? What's there to study in it, right? So this question, as readers of these genres, what are we expected to do, especially as we respond in writing? And that's really part 2 of what we want to talk about, because it seems writers, authors, artists, painters, graphic novelists, literary critics are already doing a kind of work which makes one level of coherence. And in expressing that coherence, they may actually bring in a lot of incoherent, nonsensical things, like saying that, look at this photograph of the lake, it's actually a photograph of me. It's a completely nonsensical proposition, right? So when they're doing all of that, as readers, as students, as literary critics, when we write, what are we supposed to do, right? So here is the next thing that we want to think about. So it seems as though when we want to write coherently or understand the business of coherence and incoherence, it might actually help to pause a little bit on nonsense, because if the job is to make sense, then we may as well figure out what it is that we're calling nonsense. So how literary nonsense functions. So the title of my talk today was Colorless Green Ideas Sleep Furiously, and I'll take you there now and show you where it is that I got that sentence from. And I also want to bring in here a little bit of Lewis Carroll, right? Well-beloved, well-known, famous. Most people have encountered Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass, either in the syllabus or otherwise. These are famous sort of for being nonsensical literature. And and many languages, many cultures have traditions of nonsense literature. Why do we enjoy nonsense literature? And if it's nonsense, how is it making sense to us, right? So let's go there and see what writers are doing with that. And as readers who are in the business of making sense, what are we doing with that, right? So what I have done here is this. So the colorless green ideas sleep furiously, that sentence that was up in my title. What I've done is I've made a few more variations to that, right? So furiously sleep ideas green colorless. And then the last one, I dare any one of you to actually read it out to me, right? And my question is this. From the first, and we will all agree that colorless green ideas sleep furiously is a nonsensical sentence, right? It is a nonsensical sentence. But would we also agree that the degree of nonsense and the degree of incoherence actually increases as we go through each sentence, right? So then what is it that makes things more nonsensical or more incoherent? And what is it that seems less incoherent in comparison and seems almost like it might make sense? So these 3 sentences that I have here, do we see a pattern in this, right? And somebody already said that when we are making sense of what is coherence, coherence is the ability to make patterns. So take a minute and maybe type a response in the chat box and answer to exactly this question. Do you see a pattern in these 3 sentences in the way that it becomes increasingly more nonsensical? What is changing in each of these sentences as it becomes more and more nonsensical?
Ritan says the change in the order of words.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's an excellent answer. Change in the order of the word. So the first sentence has a certain order. And the second seems more nonsensical because the order is now, it's not, even if we don't know what is the order of the first sentence yet, and we will talk about, that's the next thing. But the second just seems like a list of words thrown together. There doesn't seem any logic to it at all. And the third sentence, what's going on?
The third sentence, 1 second. Yeah, the disposition of nouns and then playing with the letters in them.
Right. So here, the third one, even the letters have been scrambled. We can't recognize. So someone said order, right? So here we know that these are words, but the alphabets have been scrambled to the extent that we can't recognize the words also. So it actually doesn't matter what, in what relation they stand to each other, because here even the words are scrambled, right? So even though this is nonsense, we already begin to see a pattern in this, and the pattern is a scrambling of order, whether at the level of words or whether at the level of alphabets. That kind of gives us a sense for what the pattern in this nonsense is. So look at what just happened. What we are given is complete nonsense. And as literary critics, as readers, even in that, we are able to see a pattern and say, oh, this is how the nonsense is working, right? So what do literary critics do? They look at words and sentences and figure out these patterns, and they write about that, right? So one of the things that we do when we read is we really look for patterns of coherence, or what makes something nonsensical or incoherence. That's also something we can write about, right? Now, let's get into this question about why the first sentence is actually relatively less nonsensical than the third one, right? Why is it? And we would all, I think, agree that that makes, if we have to say that it makes sense, that sentence probably does most than the others do. And the reason for that is the following. So this is not my sentence. Chomsky, the famous linguist, came up with this sentence way back in 1957. And what Chomsky said, used this to really demonstrate, is that, you know, sentences have inherent, or rather, when we learn languages, or whatever our first or native languages, when we learn that, and this is before we learn reading or writing, when we listen, you know, as children pick up languages, rules of grammar or structures of grammar become innate. So when, for example, we are acquiring a second language, and for many of us, if not for all or most of us, English is possibly a second language. English is a second language to me. I know it's a second language to Pritha for sure. So when we learn new languages, why is it that our teachers will say practice listening, speaking, reading, writing? Because we want to make sure that, you know, in our own cases, or when we are working with students, we say that this gets internalized. So what is getting internalized? What is getting internalized are structures of grammar, right? And so in the language that we learned without reading or writing, actually, we hardly ever make any grammatical mistakes in that, right? So those structures are innate, and Chomsky basically showed that by saying that what's going on here is that you can see that there is a noun and a verb, right? And for English, at least, this arrangement of the noun and the verb is basic to a grammatical sentence, right? A noun does something, right? Now you can say, well, can ideas sleep or not? We can debate on that, but there is a noun and there is a verb. And then there are words that qualify qualities of the noun and the verb. So colorless and green are adjectives, furiously is adverb, right? And one very simple test is that if we kept the same structure, could we, and we replace the words, would that sentence make sense? And actually it does, right? So I have rewritten that. Colorful rainbow flags flap furiously, right? Can we visualize that? Can we see that happening? So I've kept the same grammatical structure. This time I've changed the words and it makes sense. So one of my big questions to you was, what is the relationship between coherence and incoherence, sense and nonsense? Turns out nonsense might actually have a very coherent structure. And much literary nonsense is based on that there are certain rules of grammar, certain codes that are actually systematic and maintained. But on top of that, there is some mix-up which actually continues to allow you to sort of enjoy something about it and enjoy the nonsense, precisely because there is a structure that still innately makes sense. So what's the point? That grammar is, so we started with the idea of coherence at the level of sentences. And there, this is a very encouraging, I feel, this is a very encouraging idea that grammar is or can become instinctive. And when we realize that, then suddenly all this writing seems a lot less scary, because then it means that all I've got to do is, if I'm reading, writing, listening enough in the language that I'm trying to write, then actually instinctively I will get it right. And if I'm getting it wrong, then I can teach myself to fix it. It's really not such a big deal, right? So I think that's a very encouraging thing to remember about grammar. And it's also important to remember that learning grammar and only correct grammar is actually not going to fully help you make sense either. So making sense, it turns out, needs something else, and realize what it takes, right? And we also learned, and this follows from what some of you contributed, to make sense, readers will supply the difference in logic and in rationalization. So I loved it when I asked, someone actually responded and said that the image that didn't make sense, I made sense of it, I rationalized, and readers will do that. Readers and authors are very smart, they know this. So quite often they will write in a way where they will invite the reader to come in and make the rest of the sense, right? And this is, we have not covered all genres of writing at all. I also, people who know me know that I write a lot of haiku. And one of the rules of haiku is that when you write, you create the images in a way that the reader who reads your haiku finishes. So my teacher loves to say that you're really making a half circle in your haiku, and the reader who reads the haiku completes the other half of the circle. So writing in a way where readers are encouraged to participate and make sense of what you're doing is actually a very interesting writing strategy that, as readers, as students of literature, when we do analysis, when we do interpretation, and Cheyenne is going to talk a lot more about that, is something that we do when we are writing in response to it. So turns out what Chomsky did, much before Chomsky came up with that sentence, Lewis Carroll and Jabberwocky had already done what Chomsky is theorizing much later. This is 1871. That was, I think, 1957. So what is, and I know that, again, this is a text that is there in your syllabus. So for those of you who read it, or those of you watched the Tim Burton film, there's an absolutely wonderful rendition of the Mad Hatter reciting Jabberwocky to Alice. And as the Hatter recites exactly these first four lines, Alice is sort of scrambling on the hat and says, "What?" And the Hatter looks at us and says, "What? And then goes on saying whatever. So it's a really amazing moment where, the listener or the reader wants to say, "Well, I don't understand what you're saying." But the person reciting, the person writing, says, "What do you mean you don't understand?" Right? And then Alice actually gets into the narrative, and so do the viewers of the film. And even though there are so many words in the poem that make zero sense, we all sort of understand what Jabberwocky is all about, right? Isn't that absolutely marvelous, that a poem which has, and if you look at the bottom, I've actually kept all the good English words and I've put blanks where the nonsense words are. And it's really only that. It's on the basis of those words, those English words that we recognize, that we're able to make sense of Jabberwocky. And most of the words in Jabberwocky make absolutely no sense. But if we follow what Chomsky said that the underlying structure of the grammar will actually help you to make sense of the sentence, even when the words are not making sense or are not in order that makes sense. As a reader, you will be able to make sense of it, right? So one of my sort of favorite books to think about sentences, and we use this a lot, is by Stanley Fish. And it's a book called reading sentences, learning to read sentences and to write them. And I have linked it. So once you get the PPT, you will get the link to the book as well. Fish has an interesting exercise in that book. What Fish does is he says that, if you take verses from Jabberwocky, and you try and replace the nonsense words with English words that we know that make sense, we will automatically pick the words that the structure of the grammatical structure of the sentence pushes us to do, precisely because of the way it is arranged, right? And I tried this exercise out myself, and we won't have the time to do this together. So when you do this, I've done it for one verse, but when you have the time, try this out on your own. You will notice that you're picking words for the nonsense words. You'll pick nouns for where nouns are required, adjectives for where adjectives. And how do you know how to do it? You know how to do it because it is inherent in the grammatical structure of the sentence. So for example, I went and I filled this out. So you can try the next verse on your own and see whether that's true or not, right? So 'twas brillig and the slithy toves, right? 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves. So I said, okay, if I have to change brillig, what would I go with? And I went with bright. And the slithy toves. So it seemed to me that toves is a noun and slithy is an adjective. So I went with 'twas bright and the shiny doves, right? And the shiny doves did groove and gesture in the cave. All flimsy were the turtle doves and the gnome brats out brave, right? So what I did was so you notice that, I've picked verbs or nouns or adverbs or adjectives. And I did that basically following what Carol was doing. And I didn't feel like putting a verb in the place of a noun. Like it was as if the sentence, the good English words that are already there, pushed me to find the right noun and the right verb and not the right noun and the verb, but the noun and the verb and the adjective where it would go, because it is inherent in the structure of the sentence. That's a very non-intuitive thing, but the minute you start doing it on your own, it's amazing, how it comes through. And the point is that, it would have been a lot of fun to do this together, but I don't have the time to do this together because there are some other exercises I want to do, but I would love for you to try this out on your own when you get a chance. So what's the point? The point is that at the level of sentences, so what have we learned so far? That coherence is the narrative authors offer to make sense of an incoherent world, right? Coherence is also the way in which readers respond by evaluating how the narrative coherence corresponds to their own experience of the world, and they may look for and may make meaning, they may make sense of the authorial strategies, and this may be in the form of gaps, disjunctions, and nonsense, right? So this idea that the reader is actually quite ready to participate in writerly strategies to make sense, even when the writer is not fully making sense. And they may not be making sense in a manifest way, but the way we notice Jabberwocky working is we're realizing that the sense making is at a more structural level, and it's and without realizing we respond to it, and that's probably the enjoyment of nonsense as well. I mean, here what I've done is I've unpacked the enjoyment of nonsense, but when we're enjoying nonsense, what exactly are we doing? We are actually responding to structures that are non-manifest, right? And so readers are very, very ready to participate. So that brings us to part 2, right? Part 2, I said, we want to think about coherence in writing when we write. And for that, I have a very simple trick today. And that simple trick is this, that, we struggle with writing. We struggle with, okay, I've written one sentence. What should I write next, right? And I'm going to suggest today that when we write that first sentence, whatever it be, that becomes our guide to what we write next. One of the struggles with writing is that we write something and then we switch from one idea to another. I'm going to do a little exercise with you where I hope, and I'm going to make this full screen right now so that we can do this exercise, is what I've done now is I have taken one very small sentence. It was taken some time ago. Those of you who have read the poem know where this comes from, but those of you who haven't, doesn't matter. So here's a very small sentence, and the sentence has 3 parts. It was taken some time ago. And what this exercise will do is we'll take this sentence as the building block for other sentences that we write, other coherent logical sentence that we write after this sentence. So here's your exercise. What I'd like you to do now is the following. So write one sentence, right? Write a logical next sentence that gives more information about it. And what I'll do is I'll show you an example. And you can now, so this is an example that I did to tell you what the exercise is meant to do. Now you can do this on your own. Write a logical next sentence that gives more information about it. So it was taken some time ago. Next sentence, the blood samples collected from everyone. So here's a sentence, next sentence, that basically tells you what it is, because in this sentence, we don't know what it is, right? Now, may I invite you to write a sentence of your own where the next sentence basically gives us information about what it is. I've picked blood samples. You don't have to pick blood samples. You can pick anything else that you like. So I'll give you a minute and you can type your answer in the chat box and Preetha can read some out to me.
It was taken some time ago, the apple of Eden taken from right under our noses.
Wonderful, the apple of Eden, excellent. So what is it? It is the apple of Eden. So whoever wrote it, hold on to that sentence and see if you can build on that narrative with the next sentence we do. Next.
Kuntal says it was taken some time ago. The thesis was from an undergraduate researcher.
Oh gosh. Oh, very good. I cannot argue with the logic of the next sentence, but yes, plagiarized work, awful, but yes, works for the exercise we are doing. Yes, what else?
It was taken some time ago. The milk from the fridge for breakfast.
Wonderful. The milk from the fridge for the, very good. Next.
It was taken some time ago. There was a blurry face on the picture.
A bloody face on the, so someone has a gory imagination like
blurry,
me.
Blurry, not bloody.
Blurry. Oh, so not as gory as mine. Just slightly less gory than mine. Very good. Yeah. So okay, you get the point, right? So you can, when we are writing, how do we decide what the next sentence should be? And what I'm saying is that it could just develop one part of the sentence. So now let's try another part. So does it have to be it? It needn't be. It can be was taken. So now the next exercise is write a logical sentence, next sentence that expands on the verb was taken. And here's my example. My example is, it was taken some time ago. It was taken in order to show that we were powerless. Why don't you try your own and type it in the chat box. So now your next sentence should expand on was taken.
It was taken to fulfill the prophecy. This is in continuation to the apple of Eden.
Yeah, it was taken some time ago. It was taken to fulfill a prophecy. Wonderful. What else do we have?
Someone says it was taken in for repair.
It was taken in for repair. Wonderful. Absolutely works. So we still don't know what it is, but the taken tells us something. It's developing the narrative in a different way. Right. Any other example?
It was taken to attack the vulnerable intranet system of the university.
Yeah, that is also possible. It was taken in order to do something. And, as I said, we all have, all kinds of imagination and, that's coming in. The intranet system of the university has also been destroyed in the process. So, okay, you get the picture. So the second sentence could very well develop was taken and not it, right? How about the third one? Write a logical next sentence that tells us more about some time ago. And I've given an example here. It was taken some time ago. In the absence, it should not be absences, it should be absence. In the absence of clocks and calendars, we couldn't tell how long it had been, right? So logically, it works, but it's now developing the third part. Now, why don't you go ahead and try this on your own?
Ashima says it was taken to mark our first summer together.
It was taken to mark our first. So some time ago qualified as first summer. Very good. Mm-hmm.
We have Mohini says a few nights back they came in to take him away.
A few nights back. Some time ago becomes few nights back, right? Anything else?
Okay, continuing the apple of Eden, it was taken the night of our meeting with the Pope, the Barbarigo.
There you go. It was taken the night of meeting the Pope. So then, again, specificity. Some time ago, what time was that? It was the night we did blah, blah, blah. So specificity, expansion, more details. So what are we learning here? We are learning that when we are writing, and we often struggle with generating text, what do I say next? One way to do that is to anchor ourselves in that very first sentence that we write, and to give more details about everything, every part of that sentence that we have written. So that actually, so this is, remember we said that, okay, logically, the sentences have to, coherent sentences will move logically. And the next thing is that they have to be a unified whole. So just with the examples that I wrote, if I put it next to the sample that we began with, this is what we get. And it actually makes, Pritha, will you read it out? Does it make sense?
It was taken some time ago, the blood samples collected from everyone. It was taken to show that we were powerless. In the absence of clocks and calendars, we couldn't tell how long it had been.
Does it make sense, Pritha?
Perfect.
Right? And so one way to generate text coherently is to see what the different parts and claims in that one sentence is, and to develop each of it, right? So if you're developing a coherent narrative anchored in a sentence, this is one way to go about it, right? Now, this is one way that we did it. And of course, that first sentence that we got is from Margaret Atwood's poem. It was taken some time ago, right? Now, how does Atwood develop it, right? It was taken some time ago. At first, it seems to be a smeared print. So look at what she's done. She's also going with the same strategy here, right? She's giving you more and more details about it, except there is one difference. Here, it is a vague it. We don't know what it is. Of course, there is the title which says this is a photograph of me, but there's no, and it was taken some time ago. When we take photographs, we use the verb take. So we may think at that point that, oh, she's talking about a photograph, but she's not made that connection. We are functioning on a vague it, and look at what she's done. That is what the structure of the poem is. It was taken, it seems to be, as you scan it, you see, right? And then as you scan, what do you see? She gives you a description that there is a branch, there is a lake, there is a house, there's a background, there are low hills. But that is what it is. The structure is following that. It was taken some time ago. And then this is the first half of the poem. We have read the second half of the poem already, but now let's look at it again. It is what the photo. In the second half, which is, by the way, entirely in parentheses, as if that is not the point of the poem at all. She's hiding it. That's what we do when we put things in parentheses. That's not the main point. But of course, the rhetorical function of parentheses means the minute you see things in parentheses, your attention actually goes there. So even though syntactically, grammatically, parentheses is supposed to hide some part of text and say, okay, this is only additional information. This is not that important. Semantically, we see that the parenthesis actually draws the reader's eyes to it and gives it more significance, right? So here, the second part is the one. So it's working on it was, it seems, as you scan it, then finally what it is the photographs comes in the second half inside the parentheses, right? Then some time ago, right? All of you also gave details about some time ago. Here she says, when was the some time ago? The day after I drowned, right? So notice how Atwood's poem is also functioning with the same logic. And of course, when we are writing, we have the choice to do a combination of all of this. We may just take the first part or take the first and the last part or bring it in different ways. I mean, that's where artistic skill, the skill of the writer is. But what I want you to see is the logic. The logic is the same, that if you've written a first sentence, then the rest of whatever you are writing will follow from that. And how you follow from that is basically your skill as a writer. And you see Atwood doing the same thing, right? The second point I want to draw your attention to is one we have been making constantly, that writers know this habit that readers have, that they're quite happy to be drawn into incomplete, incoherent things and left to their own devices to make sense of it. And in fact, this poem very cleverly does that, right? This poem actually invites the reader's participation in something nonsensical. As I said earlier, how can a dead person show you a photo of a lake and say, hey, look carefully, it's a photo of me? It's an absolutely nonsensical situation. But she does exactly that, right? And she says, as you scan it, and I'm not doing it, I'm just leaving a bunch of information and clues. You finish the picture. You make sense of it, right? And she will even highlight the fact that, everything is so blurry and bleak and you can't really tell why, because the effect of water on light is a distortion. Everything is distorted. You can't see very well. I'm drowned and dead. But you know what? If you pay attention, if you look long enough, eventually you will be able to see me, right? So Atwood is also doing that. Atwood is also making a distinction on, I'm the author. I'm only going to do this much. You are the reader. Here is what you are. So this is a great poem about reading a poem and how readers are invited to make sense of things that don't. Jabberwocky also, right? And that's the point that Chomsky is making, that some inherent structural sense, and the reader will connect their own experience to it to complete the picture and make sense. And quite often as literary critics, students, scholars, readers, what are we doing? You're doing exactly this. So when you're writing that paper, when you're writing that answer, what are you doing? You're doing exactly this. You've been invited by Atwood to make sense. You get into the poem and you complete the picture and you make sense, right? So what's the point, right? So the point is this, that when we write our papers, our answers, our conference presentations, or when Atwood writes a poem, we are basically doing the same thing, right? Coherent writing means giving more information on the parts of the sentence already written. Now, with the poet may take certain licenses about which part to do first or next or later. The genre lets her do that. When we're writing an academic essay, we have to be a little bit more systematic about it. So what we noticed, and this is something you saw earlier, if we put all those sentences together, Pritha already read it out, it kind of makes sense. And what have we done here is we have taken, with every next sentence, we have taken one part of the first sentence and we made sense, right? But there might be another way to do it. Pritha, can you disable whatever this annotation?
Yeah, somehow I'm not being able to do that.
So may I please request all of you to be careful to keep your cursors sort of out of the screen? Yeah. So there is another way to do this. And we could also take only one part of the first sentence and develop it for a few sentences or a paragraph. So even then we would get a very different kind of result. May I request you to read it, Pritha?
Yeah. It was taken some time ago. It was taken to show us that we were powerless. Those that could take our blood samples against our will were exactly the people we were protesting. They kept us in the dark without clocks or calendars, so we couldn't tell exactly how long ago they took it.
Thank you. So what have I done here? What is going on here? Right? Are you able to notice? I've highlighted the parts. So instead of developing each part in the next sentence, I've stuck with one part, right? This was taken some time ago, and I've taken that idea and I've written more. And you can have a paragraph that just takes one part of the sentence and develops it. And in doing that, I had to introduce something new. Those that could take it. It was taken by someone, but I made sure that it's closely tied together. And this is how ideas develop. You add a new thing and you go on, but you basically stick to the same thing. This is coherence. This is continuity, and you can also do this. Now, let me give you another example where I don't develop taken, but I develop it. Shayantan, may I request you to read this?
Absolutely. It was taken some time ago. The blood they forcibly drew from us. By now, they must have run it in their labs and got the antibodies they were after. Our blood was all we were worth, having survived the infection.
Thank you. So, of course, you can see where my imagination is, dystopic imagination is coming from. But the point to notice here also is if I decide to focus on it and develop only that, I end up getting a very, very different kind of a paragraph, right? So when we talk about creativity, when we talk about, how are, responses to the same assignment different as different people write it, this is an example of that, if you, depending on what you choose to focus and develop literally at the level of the sentence, you are going to get completely different ways of responding, writing, whether it is creative writing or academic writing, it's applicable to both. In fact, this thing that I'm saying, that you could in your next sentence develop only one part of the sentence, do we see, for example, Hilary Shute do this in her academic prose? So that's what we're going to look at. And also this question, how we choose to write the next sentence as following from the first sentence we write, helps us understand how there can be many responses to the same assignment, right? And we will look at Satrapi to understand how this functions. So these two things now, let's turn our attention to. So this is an example from Hilary Schute's essay. I won't read all of it, but just the way that I have highlighted in yellow certain phrases, you will see that this is exactly how Hilary Shute has written a paragraph. The very first sentence, she says, there are many formats for comics which all carry unique cultural baggage. And the rest of the paragraph basically is going to develop this idea of the many formats and forms of comics. And even if we don't read the full thing right now, and we can't, because, interest of time, the way that I've highlighted it, do you notice that that keeps coming back? Comic strip, comic book, comic inhabits, all kinds of serial forms, formats, comic page itself, both forms, as a form, the aspect of the form. So just by highlighting the phrases, I hope I'm being able to make a point to you that even when we are writing academic prose, this is a very, very useful strategy to write. Write your first sentence, whatever it is that you're writing. And the way to make a coherent paragraph is to focus on one part of the claim in that sentence, that here the idea that there are many formats for comics, that you write a paragraph, what that means, expanding on just that one idea. So there are two ways to do it, either to take different parts of the sentence and develop it in the paragraph. That's one thing. And you can also combine it. There are no rules that you can do only this or that, but I'm just highlighting to you how we might write a coherent narrative by basically using one sentence as a building block for other sentences, for, for coming up with an entire paragraph, actually, right? Now, the second point, right? And this sort of takes us back to our very first exercise as well, where we had, where I asked you to write about your experience, and someone came up with a response having read the definition. Other people use their experiences. So let's look at what's going on here. Preetha, may I request you to take us through this this graphic page here?
In class, the teacher asked us to write a report about the war. It's a difficult subject, but it concerns us all. Think about it carefully. I didn't need to do much thinking. I knew all about the war. You know what you're going to say? Totally.
Okay, Preetha, you're a teacher. Tell me, what are we seeing in this panel? And, we are all writers also. Sometimes we see ourselves doing this. There's a topic, there's an assignment question, and, a paper to be written on a topic. And we are also teachers, and we assign topics to our students, and we get a kind of paper where this is what exactly is happening here, Preetha, you think?
So it's, of course, a classroom scenario where the teacher is giving certain instructions to the students to write a particular essay or a topic of a report on the war.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you see, which is probably the back of the classroom, we can imagine again trying to make sense of it, that there are two students who are sitting there who are now thinking about how to approach this peer report. And what we have on the top of the panel is basically what the author is thinking in her mind. And the conversation that is happening is between her and presumably her classmate or friend, who is saying that, you know, what are you going to say if she already knew? And she's like, yeah, totally, I know absolutely what I have to say.
So notice also that the teacher has introduced this and look, this is a difficult subject. Think about it carefully, giving the students time. And one student says, oh, I know everything about it. I already know what to say. I'm going to write it, right? And this often happens not just to our students, but also to us, that we're given a topic and we've read something on it, either newspaper report or a book or whatever else, or someone has told us something about it. And we feel like we know about this topic already. And the teacher is saying it's difficult, think carefully. Students are like, yeah, it's very easy. I know all about it. I'm going to. And the student, and look at the expressions on their faces. One of them is like, yeah, I totally know what I'm going to write. Very smug, very happy. The other is looking completely sad and confused. You know what you're going to say. And this, I want us to pause just a bit on it, because it seems as though that's the way to come first in class, right? I know everything. I know the answer. I've read up on it and I'm a good student. I can do this homework, right? And the other is a student who's saying, I don't know, right? This position of not knowing what you're going to say before you start writing an essay, right? And let's see what Satrapi has to say about this. So do you want to take us through this panel now, Preetha?
Yeah. I wrote 4 pages on the historical context entitled, quote, "The Arab Conquest and Our War," unquote. I was very proud of myself. This war is the same as the one 1400 years ago, but the teacher didn't seem too impressed. That's pretty good. Now, Pardees, come to the blackboard. Pardees's report was by far the best. It was a letter to her father in which she promised to take care of her mother and little brother.
Okay. And I'm not included the next panel, and where we learned that Pardees's father had basically died in the revolution, and which is the reason why she's promising her father to take care of her mother and her brother, right? So now my question, so here's a student who's written the essay, has written 4 pages. There's a title, there's an apt comparison of the war that was 1400 years ago, 4 pages, by the way, 4 pages, essay, title, comparison with war 1400 years ago. And we know this kid reads a lot and has been reading. Remember the very first example, I didn't understand anything, so she starts reading to make sense. So she's taken all the knowledge that she's read and she's written, I'm sure, and she's like, I'm very proud of myself. I've written an essay, 4-page essay, but the teacher didn't seem too impressed. Why not? Right? So you read everything, you've written a 4-page, you've got a title, you have a thesis where you're saying that this is like the war 1400 years ago. So why is the teacher not impressed? And why is her friend Paradise's letter to her father, a dead father, it turns out, by far the best? What is happening here? Why is it so? What is going on? So I guess my question is, and take a minute and you can respond in the chat box, what is the difference in Margie's and Pardees's approach to making sense of the war? And then my second question is, why is Pardees's response better than Margie's? And it's not just that the teacher is saying this is better. She says, the Margie herself says that that's the best response. Look at the faces. Everybody in the class is crying, right? Why? What is going on here? So if you could just break it down like this, what's the difference? What's the difference in the 2 ways to write the same assignment question?
So Gopal has an answer. Margie's report is objective and Pardees's report is subjective. Pardees's report is better because it sparked empathy and sympathy while telling about the war, relatability.
Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you, Gopal. So you're using the words objective and subjective. Are there ways in which we might expand these notions? What are some of the other responses coming in, and that might help us sort of add to what Gopal has said?
Vrittan says lived experience.
Lived experience. The difference between Margie's and Pardis's approach to the assignment, writing this essay, is that Pardise is going to bring in her, and what Gopal calls subjective, is the lived experience of the war. Whereas what Margie's essay has done is that it's taken up a bunch of sources and it's done a very competent job of it. What it lacks is that, experience, writing from experience. It lacks affect. It lacks, really owning the subject and thinking about what it means to her, right? Whereas Paradise's response is about what it means to her. Someone used the word relatability, that there is a way in which she relates the topic to herself. And because she does that, her classmates, as you can see in the image, and the teachers also are able to relate to that, right? So you literally see all of them are crying, right?
Riju says something really interesting.
Yes.
Pardise managed to weave her coherence from the real nonsensical world.
Mm-hmm.
So
can you repeat that?
Paradise managed to weave her coherence from the experiences of the real nonsensical world.
That's very, very good. So then what is more incoherent and nonsensical than war, right? And they're all trying to make sense of coherence of the war. And I think this is a really wonderful response, Riju, where you say that she is using her subjective experience to bring coherence or understanding of what this really chaotic situation, what is more chaotic than, a situation of war, right? So bringing back, so thank you for bringing us back to the vocabulary of nonsense and coherence, incoherence and coherence, and how Paradise is using her subjective experience to really bring coherence to something that is really at one level the most incoherent thing that we possibly can come up with, right? Any other responses?
Adi says Margies narrate the historical facts, but Paradise speaks about the common lives of the people who were in the war and what happened to them and families.
Wonderful. So again, expanding on what Gopal originally started us with, objective, subjective, historical fact. So one is distanced. It's distanced from the lives of the people who are living through the war. And of course, this is not some distant war. Of course, what is being described is a war that's ongoing. And that's precisely what Paradise's report does. It brings it to the present. Whereas Margie's report was, treated in a distant way, in an objective way, connecting it to wars of, 1400 years ago. What Paradise's does is it brings it to the present. It brings it to the lived experience of what the people are going through then. Excellent. Thank you so much for your responses. So I hope we saw that, right? So how we respond to an assignment question, how we write a paper, I think other than also this idea that you can anchor yourself to what you're saying in that very first sentence as a writerly strategy, also to think about, how you're going to write from a place of your own experience. So if you go back to the very first exercise I did with you, where I gave you two images and I had you think about coherence, not by looking at a dictionary definition already, but first coming at it experientially. My sense is that after that, when we looked at the dictionary definition, there's a way in which that made a kind of sense experientially, that perhaps if we didn't do that, we wouldn't. And in writing, what I'm suggesting is that this is a very, very important quality, that this is a very, very good quality. So the idea of the unified whole, where does it come from, right? So if it is to be relatable, if it is to be something that is moving, then one place it comes from is one of individual experience, right? So you don't have to reach out very far, writing from that place of experience. And I'm not saying, and I'm not using experience in the narrow way of saying, oh, you have to be in a war in order to be able to write a war, but really think about what in that speaks to you personally in a way that just thinking, okay, this is something really far away from, that those two writerly stances are very different. And I'm making a case for trying to understand how it is that it becomes something where it sparks an interest in you in a way that, okay, I can only write about it as something where I have nothing to do with it at all, right? Okay, so then that brings us to part 3 of my presentation today. And this is going to be a short one. And here I want to just think about the danger of hasty coherence. So, I began by saying that, in the beginning there was nonsense. And I guess with this crowd, I can bring up Milton, right? Remember that very beginning of Paradise Lost, where the imagery is that of a dove, right? Sitting on chaos, hatching from chaos a coherent world, right? So the idea, and not just in the Judeo-Christian mythology, but other mythologies also, the idea of seeing the beginning as nonsense and people or gods making sense of that is one way to think about how we come into the world and make sense of it, right? But now, as I warned earlier, I'm going to contradict myself, and now I'm going to do exactly that. But what if we don't actually come into a world of nonsense? How many, and here, just take a minute and think about it. Do you think of yourself as a person who was born into an incoherent world? Or do you, as you think about your own upbringing, your schooling, your neighborhood, your community, your family, your parents, or were you brought into a world full of coherent narratives actually, right? So what happens when you are born into a world which already gives you a whole bunch of coherent narratives with which to think about the world, right? And you realize as you look around that those coherent narratives are actually not that coherent. Let's look at Margie's experience here. And this is that part of the book where Margie has basically been playing Cupid to this one person who's been living in their house, and she's fallen in love with this one person who is clearly outside her social class. And Margie's father finds out and then goes and talks to the boy. And the minute the boy realizes that this girl is not of the same social class, he breaks it off. And then the father comes and talks to Margie, and this is where the panel is. Shayantan, may I request you to take us through this panel?
Yeah. You must understand that their love was impossible, father saying. Why is that? Father says again, because in this country, you must stay within your own social class. But is it her fault that she was born where she was born? Dad, are you for or against social classes? Satrapi 37.
Shayantan, thank you. So what's going on in this panel? What has Margie suddenly discovered? What is her father saying? What is going on with Margie right now? What is the coherence that Margie believed in? What is the coherence, or what's happening to her now? Anybody wants to step in and explain what's happening?
Tasnova says what Margie discovers is social division.
Correct, right? So it seems as though the coherent narrative might be that, love conquers all. Love is like, the most powerful thing. If you fall in love, and then love just makes everything work or some kind of thing. And she's learning that, wait, there's something called social class, right? And there's something called, and so look at what the father is saying. You must understand that their love was impossible. Why? Because in this country, you must stay within your social class. So a coherence of class, a coherence of caste, a coherence of patriarchy, a coherence of capitalism. These are all logical, coherent narratives, except that these are not as logical and coherent narratives because there's plenty of evidence that shows you that this is a forced coherence which actually ignores a whole bunch of evidence, right? And what we notice here, so what is happening is that you're given, you come into consciousness in a world which seems to make sense because you're told that it makes sense. And then you come across situations where you realize that that coherence is a false coherence. So here you look at the image here. It's one where Margie is holding her head and she's saying, but this doesn't make sense, right? So going from coherence to incoherence, and this is a very, very important moment, because that's partly what we have to be able to do. And what's the point of all this education? What's the point of all this critical thinking? Is that we bring critical thinking to narratives that are presented to us as coherent narratives and say, no, it is not a coherent, it's presented to us as being, look at the father sounds greatly logical, because in this country we must do, you must understand it was impossible. You must understand, right? That this is impossible. In this country, this is tradition. We do things like this. How often do we hear that, right? And so what Margie is doing is she is realizing that coherence is a false coherence, that this unifying logic that you just marry within your caste, class, religion, region, whatever that notion is. And then she's confused. She's like, but Dad, are you for this or against this? Right? And she's confused. So are you saying that we should be believing this, or are you saying that this is wrong? And she's confused, right? So what you see here is a moment of incoherence, confusion, but this is a very useful thing. This is what the job of critical thinking is. This is the job of critical reading and writing, where you're also able to question narratives that are presented as coherent. So again, if you ask me as students, when we are writing, what are we doing? This is also one of the things that we are doing, that we are looking at narratives that are presented as coherent narratives and going back and re-examining those assumptions, right? So that's basically, the larger point I want to make here, that what happens when we are handed down powerful coherent narratives as coherent, right? There's no way to question it, right? That, okay, and if you look at problem of gender, if you look at problems of caste, I mean, that's it. It's supposed to be a coherent system. It works. It's tradition. Why are you questioning that, right? And we find that coherence to be a problem, and there's quite a lot of coercion and force, right? And if we think about it like that, and we go back to the texts in our syllabus, we realize what's going on here. So why does Atwood, for example, have us look for a portrait of a drowned, presumably a woman, right? So if you read essays on this poem, it will talk to you about, okay, so it's a nonsensical proposition, but actually it's a metaphor for something. It's a metaphor for women becoming invisible. It's a metaphor for women being literally, metaphorically drowned, which she presents as a literal photograph. But as readers, what are we doing? As readers, we are making sense of it metaphorically. So why is Atwood doing that? So Atwood, in making this proposition, in inviting the reader into completing that half nonsensical proposition, is actually questioning the coherence of a certain kind of patriarchy, right? That's exactly what Atwood is inviting us to do. So why does Satrapi and her family rebel against the Islamic Revolution? Are the guardians of the revolution imposing a narrative of coherence, right? It's to all parts of culture that, okay, now women have to all dress like this. Women can go to school, but if they do blah. They do not wear clothes like this. They behave like that. What are you doing? When you make these kinds of rules and enforce it, what do you want? You want everybody to look logically consistent and coherent in a certain kind of way. But that's a forced coherence that many people are not okay with, right? So the questioning of that coherence is something that Satrapi is inviting the readers to do, right? And that's part of what is motivating this graphic novel as well. Coming to Hilary Shute, is she also doing something similar? I think she is, right? Why does Shute particularly want us to pay attention to the genre of the comics as something that will have us reevaluate many assumptions about categories of literature that or literature takes, or the study of literature takes for granted? And I've actually put that quotation right down there. Pritha, will you read that quotation?
1 second. But comics presents problems we are still figuring out. The term doesn't settle comfortably into our grammar, nomenclature remains tricky and open to debate. The field hasn't yet grasped its object or properly posed its project. To explore today's comics, we need to go beyond pre-established rubrics. We have to re-examine the categories of fiction, narrative, and historicity. Shoot
Yes.
452.
Thank you, Preetha. So even Shoot, as she's presenting the study of comics, is saying that if we study comics in a certain way, we end up looking at, certain coherent narratives of fiction, narrative, historicity as not given. We actually open up those categories again to re-understand all of that, because there's something new which is making us examine that, right? So what's the point? The point is this, that it's important that we don't ignore experiences, evidence, and subjectivities that question the coherence of our narratives, of our analysis. So we do want to write coherently, right? Writing coherently is a very, very important quality and characteristic of clear writing that communicates thought clearly. But that clarity must not come at the cost of ignoring evidence, right? So we don't want simplistic coherence, right? So the minute the coherent narrative you feel is not taking care of or not accounting for contrary evidence or experience, then we know what do we do then, right? So the point then is then to adapt the narrative, to expand it, and to make it more complex, right? So not to think that a coherent narrative is a given, right? So being able to expand it and make it more complex on the basis of evidence is ultimately what we need to be able to do. So with that, I will end my presentation with the hope that it made sense. And I'll stop sharing my screen, and we have a good 15 minutes for your questions and discussion. Anything that you want to share, any questions that you have, I'm happy to take that. We have about 15 minutes to do that. Riju Das. So we are basically drawing coherence from the incoherent. So that goes back to the question I'd asked. What is the relationship between coherence and incoherence? And there might be situations where we are drawing coherence out of incoherence, and others, it might play out differently. So I think the point is to pay attention to what is happening in what text or in a particular situation. But that's a great observation. That's absolutely very, very interesting. So I'm happy to hear from you. You can unmute or speak or put it in the chat box. Now the stage is yours. Tell me if it made sense. Shrimi gave me quite a tough job and I did it. Now please tell me if it worked or not.
Ma'am, I'd like to ask a question.
Yes, please.
So there's a technical glitch. I couldn't change the name there. This is Shweta this side. Good evening.
Okay.
Ma'am, thank you so much. Hi. It was a wonderful session. I really enjoyed it. Ma'am, I'd really appreciate if you could expand a little bit on the last point you made. For instance, there are times when one is writing a paper and is trying to argue one particular point, but by the time you end your research, you yourself realize that probably you were taking a little simplistic view of the situation, and if you use this new evidence, it might counter the argument that you yourself were making in the first part of your
yes. So thank you for asking that. Shweta, did you say?
Yes, ma'am, Shweta.
So Shweta, if you are lucky enough to write and by the end of your research realize that you've actually got some evidence that complicates what you had to say in the first part, I will say you've hit the jackpot, because then it means that you've done some actual work. You've done the work that research is meant to do, because usually what happens is what Margie did. I've read up the stuff and now I can write my 4-page competent essay, but it sometimes takes doing all of that to, by the end of it, really arrive at what it is that we want to say. And when that happens, happily embrace it and revise the first part, because then you know you have something really solid to say. So I would not take it as, oh my God, now my entire research is ruined. I would take it as, finally, I have hit the jackpot. right? And it's not at all unusual. The process of research is exactly that, because we don't start with a bingo moment. We don't start with, oh, this is my contribution to whatever. We start with, this is what I know. We start with how Margie writes her essay. But in that process, as we do more research, as we invest more in it, as we transform along with our research, we get to that part where it's like, wait, finally now something is happening. So I would say it would be very, very lucky if that happens. And when that happens, embrace it. Does that answer your question, Shweta?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank
Yes.
you, ma'am.
Riju has a question which is actually linked to this, which is, should the coherence, in a sense, always questions the incoherence it's derived from?
So, that's a abstract question in the way that I can't say yes or no. Like, this really has to be tied to the particular project you're working with, right? So, for example, in the context of this presentation itself, now, if you were to tie this to one particular part of the exercise, so say the very first exercise where you looked at an image that was abstract, right? Now, in that abstract image, now, if we ask this question that you're asking, that, should we, so what was the question again?
Should the coherence always question the incoherence it's derived from?
No, so for example, if this very question were a part of that first exercise, you weren't questioning incoherence. You were actually coming up with a narrative that made the incoherence of the image into coherent sense. So there is no questioning there. Whereas if you are handed down a coherent narrative, something that Shweta is talking about. So say Shweta is working on a research topic on something, and there's a general understanding about that topic, and everybody understands it like that. And then Shweta is like, okay, this is how this is, and then comes across some evidence which is like, wait, now this evidence makes me question that narrative. That is the moment when you go back and say that, okay, so there has to be a reason. I don't think that this is a matter of a rule that you must always, you have to look at what the context is, and then you will know whether it's a matter of pulling out coherence and making sense, or whether it's a matter of questioning it at that point. Does that help, Riju? Well, I hope it does. Any other question? Oh, Riju says thank you.
Yeah, yes.
Great. Any other questions? Observations? If you don't have a question, if you want to dwell on any part of the presentation, that's great also.
Okay, Shilija says, isn't research in literature really tricky? Because we are supposed to come up with logic and coherence based on complex, nuanced, subjective, and often seemingly incoherent works.
Thank you for that observation, I would say. Why? Because, and so isn't research in literature really tricky? I would say any kind of research in any field that involves text, it's the same proposition. So what, and how can literature help us with everything else? So now this is actually where I think the presence of so many people here who also seem not to be from literature becomes relevant. What is literature training us to do that is useful for, say, someone who's come from BCom, or someone who's doing another kind of honors or another kind of discipline, is that paying attention to text actually trains us to think in certain ways about the incoherence of the field that we're working on. That could be a social field, that could be science. How do we make sense of phenomena? How do we make sense of the world of people? How do we make sense of the world of nature? Because that's it. And at every point, we have some amount of information available, not all. And the new information keeps coming in, where we then have to open up our old way of thinking about something and start thinking about it in a new way. So yes, it's tricky in literature, but it's tricky. Research is tricky. I mean, that's why we do it, because it's challenging, and the results are therefore that much more rewarding. And the process that you've described here is true for literature, but it's true for, I think, PhDs or research in any field, science or math or social sciences. Really, I think that's how it would go. And I wouldn't even say seemingly incoherent. If you really look around, when you finish research and there's this whole amount of material and you have to write your paper or your dissertation, I mean, think about how incoherent everything seems. Like how you're like, how do I pull everything into a paper that actually makes sense? There's so much material, right? So that incoherence, that seeming on incoherence is, I think, just we can take that as the starting point for everything. Yeah.
Cheshta has a practical question, which is how to find the red flags that the writing is incoherent or is not going in the direction that one is intending to.
So this question, two ways, I will answer it in two ways. So, when we write something, it seems coherent to us, right? And then we write the draft. One useful thing is to have someone else read it, because other people who don't live in your head can see the incoherence in your writing better than you yourself can. And so I'll give you a small example that sometimes, we're writing something and we have an idea in our head and we write and we use the idea in our head and the sentence of the paper to together make sense, and it makes sense, right? Now, a peer reads it and says, this sentence doesn't make sense because you've not written those two other sentences that you thought were too obvious. And your friend says, no, those two sentences are required for this sentence to make sense. So one way is, and writing is interesting that way, is that, it is both an individual process that has part of it has to be done in isolation. But the point of writing is that it has to reach a public that understands it, right? So when you write it, then it's really useful to work with peers, with a community of peers, classmates, teachers, other people who are in a position to give you feedback. They can point out and say, okay, this is where the steps are missing and I don't understand. Now, point two is, what was the second point that you had? What was the whole thing?
That it is not going in the direction that one is intending.
Intended. So now it's not going in the direction it's intended. Now here I will answer it by saying the following. Now going back to again that example where Margie writes an essay saying, I know exactly where it's going, right? And she writes that essay and the teacher is not impressed, right? And the other kid is like, I don't know. You know what to say? I don't know what to say. And turns out that coming from a place of not knowing, that person ends up writing a much more, an essay that everybody really loves, including the teacher, right? So this point that you made about what if it's not going where I intended to go, I'll answer by saying, be open to saying initially, first draft, that you don't know where it's going. Let it go where it's going, then reread it and say where it went. And it may be, and in fact, that's where the real writing, real work has happened, that in the process of writing, you've actually figured what you want to say, not that you already knew what you wanted to say. So if the process of writing brings you to saying something you didn't know to say before, that's when you know the actual work has happened. So starting from a place of not knowing is usually more productive in terms of producing knowledge that is useful to you and others, is much better than saying, okay, I figured it all out and I'm starting from there. And not that you'll do badly, you'll get your B+, but that's not where A papers come from.
And while we are at the a topic of drafts, I think this is something that would help Mahima, who asks, what do we do when we have a strict word limit?
Yes. So in fact, this was something that your principal also started talking about, that, there was this answer that I had to write that I had to do in 200 words. It's such a big topic, right? So here is how I would think about. Recently, in fact, I was collaborating on a piece that I was writing with somebody else, and we had a very strict word. So two of us were writing one piece, which was supposed to be 1500 words in all, right? So, so we said, okay, why don't we first say what we have to say in as many words as it takes? And again, this is starting from a place of, I really don't know what ultimately I want to say. So let me put everything down on paper. And from that, then pick out the thing that can be said in 200 words, right? So then you condense it. So one way to do an effective 200 words, 500 words, whatever your small word limit may be, is to first expand on your idea and see what it is that you really want to say. And when you figured it out, you can do it in 10 words, you can do it in 20 words, you can do it in 50 words. So when you know what it is you have to say, then the word limit is not a problem. Then you can adequately expand it to give more details or not, because you know what you want to say. The problem is when you are using the 200 words to figure out what you want to say. So to figure out what you want to say, give yourself as many words as you need, then condense it to 200 words or less or whatever it is. Yeah. Does that answer, Mahima?
I think there's another very important question from Rituparna.
Yeah.
How do we change our ideas while moving from one paragraph to another and still maintain coherence? I always find it difficult to write conclusions. So if you could talk a little bit about that, it would be really helpful. So there are two questions, basically.
Two questions there, and I will be able to answer one question effectively now. And the other question I promise that I will answer by creating, or we have already created it, we have not put it up. Preetha and I actually worked on an Instagram post of, I think, 3 or 4 posts in which we basically figured out how to, like, in a minimal way, help students understand what a conclusion is. Preetha, this might be a good reason to now put it online.
Yeah.
We will answer that question, but we will answer that question in that post. But let me take your first question. And in fact, this was something I was thinking about as something that I've not included in the presentation. It's a very, very important point. Coherence also, so we said coherence is continuity, right? So if you look at the academic essay or any kind of work, actually, how do you, and films and comics actually are a very, very good example of that as well, is how do you go from one idea to the next, right? And that's very challenging because that's where your narrative thread of logic becomes clear, right? So how are you moving from one thing to the next? What are those connecting sentences? And there is a technical term for that. The technical term for that is transition sentences. And quite often, transition sentences get written in after you've written your draft. Like, it doesn't come automatically. So what we're also suggesting is that writing happens in stages, happens in drafts. So you figure that you've written 3 paragraphs, but they don't seem connected. Writing those topic sentences and transition sentences that are connected by literally repeating words between one sentence and the next is one way in which you build the connection. So what I want to suggest to you is, don't think that coherence is automatic. I think that's part of the problem. We think that if we say or do something, it's automatically coherence. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. Coherence takes a lot of work. Continuity and flow, by the end of it, seems like, oh, so easy it is. It must just have come just like that. But it doesn't. You have to work on it repeatedly. You have to write those sentences, make sure words are mirrored, repeated. Sometimes you do synonyms. Those are tricks that you use to make sure that you write in the flow. And it usually happens in the later parts of the drafts, not at the beginning. And just to say, a conclusion works in a similar way, where a conclusion is going to mirror the introduction in some ways. You take the reader back to the introduction, but without repeating it. And what tricks there are for it, I would say that just wait a couple of days, we'll put it up on our center's Instagram page, because we've actually worked on it. It's ready. We've just not had a chance to put it up. So Preetha, now you know we need to get that done. All right. So Rituparna, please look out for that. We'll put it on our Insta and our FB pages as soon as Preetha and I get down to doing it. It's ready. It just needs to now be made into a post.
And also, I would take this moment to say that Shantanu has shared the links to our social media pages on the chat. For those of you who are interested, please follow us. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And the reason to do that is because we keep posting these resources. So we keep posting videos of our workshops, these little tricks and tips about writing. So if you're interested in this, you might find useful things there. It's time. Shrimi, now we will do as you tell us to do.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for the absolutely enriching session. I mean, I am very, very glad that I requested you to address the question of coherence, and I'm so grateful that you obliged. The participation itself stands as testimony to the success of the workshop, I guess. Thank you so much. I'm thoroughly delighted. And in fact, we have a lot of responses flowing in for the feedback form. I request the others to respond. I have shared the link again. Here, I would like to invite Binoy sir, the convener of the English Literary Society, Aryabhat College, to render the vote of thanks for our speaker, Dr. Dasgupta.
Good evening. Thank you, Shrimi.
First of all, Binoy, hi. Binoy and I
Hello. Hi.
go back years and years. We taught together many years ago at Stephens. So first of all, that. And then, Binoy, you can now go on and be formal.
Thank you so much, Ananya. You know, I mean, we had tried doing this earlier as well, but for some reason it could not work out. But thank you, Shrimi, as well, and Madhulika for, putting it together, and Ananya, of course, and a fabulous team, who brought this together, because I think, among a number of things that we do, seminars, conferences, all of which do help our students, I think this is something that we lack, and I appreciate that all of you took out time and, have so cogently put it all together for our students, and I hope that we can do more of it. Of course, there are already two more, that we have as part of this series, but I really hope that we can do more and more of this exercise, which I think is really what is going to equip our students to think coherently, logically, and create, narratives, multiple narratives that we need of anything that we are sort of, engaging with. So thank you, Ananya, thank you, Shrimi, thank you, Madhulika, and everybody else, everyone here, who also have shown such great enthusiasm and have participated in great numbers. It's also very encouraging to see big numbers, which also shows how people are, really following Ananya's workshop. Because personally, I've seen her, because of the number, posts that she puts up on regarding the workshop that she's been doing for long at a number of institutions. I was very envious, and I really wanted to attend. And finally, I've got the opportunity to hear her firsthand, her workshop, and I'm so privileged, I think, to be a participant in that sense as well. So thank you, everyone, and all the best to all of you. Thank you.